Welcome to Talking Pictures. My name is Christian Genzel. I'm a filmmaker and film journalist from Salzburg, Austria. Talking Pictures is a podcast series in which I talk to the people who made some of my favorite movies. Today's guest is screenwriter and director Menno Meyjes, best known for his collaboration with Steven Spielberg in the 1980s. Menno was born in the Netherlands but moved to the United States in 1972 to study at the San Francisco Art Institute. After writing a script for one of the best-known episodes of Spielberg's Amazing Stories TV series, The Mission, starring a young Kevin Costner and directed by Spielberg himself, Menno received an Academy Award nomination for his adaptation of Alice Walker's Pulitzer Prize-winning novel The Color Purple, as directed by Spielberg. As a screenwriter, he also worked on films like Franklin Schaffner's Lionheart, Russell Mulcahy's Ricochet, and Edward Zwick's The Siege. After The Color Purple, Menno was brought in to work on the third Indiana Jones movie, Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, taking over from writer Chris Columbus, whose Monkey King script had been rejected. In our conversation, Menno talks about his collaboration with George Lucas and Steven Spielberg, and how elements like the search for the Holy Grail and Indy's father were introduced. He also discusses some of the other films he's worked on, including his directorial debut Max, an independent gem starring John Cusack as a Jewish art dealer based in Munich who, shortly after World War I, encounters a young, struggling painter named Adolf Hitler, whose anger and disillusionment is slowly finding other, more harmful outlets. Menno also talks about his work on Manolete, a biopic starring Adrien Brody as the popular Spanish bullfighter, and he discusses his more recent move back to the Netherlands to direct independent films like The Dinner and The Reunion. If you enjoy my conversation with Menno Meyjes, please visit talkingpicturespodcast.com to check out more interviews and follow us on Facebook and Twitter. So without any further ado, here is Menno Meyjes recalling how he came on board of Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade.
I have to say it's a long time ago. And the other thing is that, if you remember the 80s, you weren't there. I do remember that, I was working with Steven a lot at that moment. And I think he said, can you go to San Francisco and talk to George and sort of see what he's got. I don't want to do the Monkey King. Why don't you guys kind of talk and see if you can come up with anything. It was something like that.
Mm-hmm.
So I went up to San Francisco and sat down with George.
Was the idea of the search for the Holy Grail, was that already in place when you met with George?
No, I mean, and I have to say that maybe George thought of it earlier and some other time, but because I just to kind of refresh my memory, I kind of read the Wikipedia page on it.
Okay.
And look, I mean, my thinking was the following, which was I had the idea of the Holy Grail because I thought that nothing would ever top the Ark of the Covenant.
Mm-hmm.
And that to try and come up with something as spectacular was a dead end because it couldn't be done. So I thought we'd make a sideways move, which was the Holy Grail, which was much more ephemeral. Did it even exist? That kind of thing. And to your point of the architecture of Indiana Jones, I learned something very interesting at that moment because when I said this to George, he said, but Indy would never have that idea because Indy is a materialist. And I thought that's really fascinating because it just shows you how, they understood, and especially George, in that respect, understood the character of Indiana Jones very well and what he would do and what he wouldn't do. So then he said he either needs a girlfriend or a father
Mm-hmm.
to come up with this idea, but he would never come up with it. So
Mm-hmm. So a materialist in the sense of that he's searching for something tangible.
yes,
Mm-hmm.
that's right.
Mm-hmm.
And and if you look at what he had been doing previously, that was all borne out. I mean, he was the kind of supreme materialist.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah, especially in Raiders of the Lost Ark. I mean, when you see the warehouse at the end of the movie with all the artifacts that have been stored and collected in a way.
Yeah, and I have to say, it really taught me. I really I just went, wow, that's just so interesting that you so understand your kind of character,
Mm-hmm.
what he wouldn't do.
Did you do a lot of research on the Grail?
Well, I mean, there is there I my research on the Grail, of course, was a little bit in the at this point there was a book I think called The Spear of Destiny,
Mm-hmm.
which was some ridiculous sort of book, like it was this time of Holy Blood, Holy Grail. You had the Spear of Destiny. You had that guy who thought that the pyramids were built um, by people from outer space, Eric von Daniken or whatever his name was. And I remember, people. Somebody gave me this book, and I kind of flipped through it and I thought that to some degree or other, it slightly rang true that especially Himmler would have had some interest
Mm-hmm.
in the in the occult. And there are always these stories that they had a small department uh, that concerned itself with this kind of archaeology.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the
But
Ahnenerbe. That's what
yeah,
they called it. Yeah.
yeah. And whether how much of that is true or mythology or legend, but I mean, I'm a dramatist. So I'm not an academic. It doesn't need to be. It doesn't need to be true for me. I just went, oh well, So there we go. So in that sense, that's about as much research as we did.
Mm-hmm. I was asking also because at the time, I think you had already written the screenplay for Lionheart about the Children's Crusade, and that goes back to the same period where many of the Grail stories originated.
Yeah, and I did that. I researched very much. I'd written that actually quite a few years before, and that I did proper research on. Yeah, it's always and I had been. I also I had been to Petra,
Mm-hmm.
and a few about I think in end of '84, '85. I'd been to Petra, and that also made I thought it was a spectacular location.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that well, I found very little about um, the content of the two drafts. What I found is from this book, the complete making of the Indiana Jones movies, which has a little sidebar in it, just a very little synopsis of the story in your draft.
What does it say?
Um, well, let me see. It's 4 paragraphs. It says, the first draft opens with a battle in Mexico between Indy and Banano, a crazed individual with a whip and a loyal band of guerrillas. The object of their dispute is the death mask of Montezuma. Indy manages to throw Banano off a cliff and his guerrillas go free. No sooner is he back in the States than Indy has to depart for France to look for his father, who has disappeared while looking for the Holy Grail. With a friend named Maud, he goes to Montségur, where they meet a nun named Chantal and her relation Delaware, who explains that they had found a map that led Indy's father to Venice. It goes on for a bit, it mentions Petra as well, but I find Montségur very interesting because that ties in with the Cathar legend that they had the Grail in their possession.
I never started anything with a battle in Mexico.
Okay.
So I mean, it's completely. I don't know where that must be maybe some Chris Columbus script or I don't know. No, the only thing that Steven had was he had this idea, and I don't know if we even started with it, but he had this idea that Indy, because that actually then led to my later on making a movie about Manolete.
Mm-hmm.
That he had this idea that we'd be on in Morocco on at a roulette table, and first there would be a hat that was thrown on the roulette table, and then a leather jacket, and then the whip.
Mm-hmm.
And then Indy was losing badly, and then I thought to myself, well, so then what would you do? So he's in Tangier or Marrakesh, and then you would take the boat. I don't know, you were a stowaway. If you're totally broke, you're a stowaway, and you go across to Spain, and you probably land at Tarifa, and then you would hitchhike, and then maybe, and the only people that had cars at those days, because Spain was so poor, would be the bullfighters. And then I actually started doing research on bullfighters, and then years later I made a movie about Manolete with Adrian Brody. So but I certainly know that we didn't start with that we didn't start that way. Okay. I don't know how I forgot kind of how we started. I think I should have a draft somewhere. Mm-hmm. Should look it up. But the problem with these drafts is that now everything is digital, and then it was on paper, and it actually disappears.
Mm-hmm. The opening, as described in the book, sort of has a James Bond-like quality to it, right? He's on his latest mission. You see him in a situation that hasn't got much to do with the rest of the story.
Yeah.
So what about the character of Indiana Jones himself? I mean, you've already said that George Lucas said he's a materialist. I was wondering, I mean, the character had pretty much been developed through the first two movies. So what were the guidelines that you had to work with, or what was the development that you could sort of do with the character?
Well, the great thing, I mean, it was fun working with George because we'd really actually work together. I would drive over to the Lucas Ranch, and we'd sit down and we'd say, okay, what are we going to do kind of today? So I didn't really feel like, had I been alone in my room, then I would have picked up the phone and said, George, can I do this? Can I do that? But, he was very loose, very free with it all. So, I mean, I felt like I was with, certainly the co-creator of it. And I didn't really, other than that very incisive comment about, Indy as a materialist, I didn't really feel, it was let's just get something going and not worry about, it was very loose.
So essentially, I think the Indiana Jones stories always start with the mystery, with the myth that they're the one thing that Indiana Jones is looking for, and then the rest of it sort of is built around that mystery, right?
Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not quite sure if it's as sort of formulaic. It's not like you don't really start these things saying, right now we need, because the tradition is, because at this point, only 2 movies had been made. So, it wasn't like I was getting from George, now the tradition is at first it has to be this way, and then we're going to go that way with it. Mm-hmm. I think we were very much for a while pursuing the idea of a girlfriend before we landed on the father. But as I said, I was writing a lot of screenplays in those days, and and the way I kind of write is I kind of just sit there and kind of go unconscious. And I mean, when I'm directing my own stuff, I'm constantly having to read the text because I don't, it's very different. I don't remember what I wrote. So because you kind of go into this kind of almost unconscious state,
Hmm.
and then something comes through you. So it's difficult for me to think exactly. I wish I did. Like I said, I wish I had a draft here.
Hmm.
But I do, I mean, at a certain point, we explored the idea of the girlfriend. Steven wasn't that crazy about it. We'd go see Steven, he was like, I don't know. Because I think the girlfriend, I think that George and I went a bit mad, and we had the idea of like the girlfriend was a nun. So Steven was like, let's not do, you know, that seemed a little too controversial to him. So then we landed on the father, and then it was then, and that's the great thing about working with those guys. You know how you sit around till you play this game, let's cast so and so, you have an idea for a movie, and then you start casting it in when you're talking to your friends. Well, with these guys, they just pick up the phone and actually call Sean Connery.
Hmm.
That's sort of the difference between them and everyone else. So I mean, that was at a certain point, it could only have been Sean Connery. It wasn't like they went, oh well, let's should be Paul Newman, or no, it
Hmm.
only been Sean Connery. So.
Hmm. But apparently, from what I gather in this description of the first draft, which I mean we know now is not exactly what it was, but and apparently he only meets his father at the end of the story. So it's not like the finished movie where he sort of rescues him at the midpoint.
Yeah, I think we had this idea that he would meet him at the excavation site. Obviously, it was it was a much better idea to have the father involved. I think we then started working on having the father involved earlier, but
Hmm.
at one point I went on to other things.
Hmm. So how was the father characterized in those early stages of the script?
Yeah, I'm trying to remember. I mean, I think as in a more sort of jocular adversarial way. I mean,
Hmm.
as a kind of movie father,
Hmm.
who felt slightly embarrassed by his son.
Hmm.
His kind of mercenary son.
Hmm.
So I mean, obviously you want to create something between some tension between these two characters.
Hmm. Yeah, I mean, when I look at your movies, you very often have relationships between two characters, so very difficult relationships, very complicated relationships. So I was wondering if that played into it. I mean, if I look at a film like Max or My Martian Child, which you didn't write, but still it's your movie, um, or a film like
Amazing how much I wrote of Martian Child.
okay, well, you don't have a credit, so
No,
I
no,
wasn't
it's
sure.
very difficult. It's very, very difficult. Once you direct, you have to prove that you wrote over 60% of the script.
Okay.
But well, you always try to you always try to get something going between the characters.
Hmm.
I mean, resolution is lovely in life, but in movies, it's not that great.
Yeah.
So you try and I once worked with George Miller, and he always had this saying, drama for nothing.
Hmm.
So that certain situations are inherently dramatic. So a Jewish art dealer and Adolf Hitler, that's drama for nothing. It's an inherently, we
Hmm.
might say, that's a very controversial idea, or that's a terrible idea, or whatever. But it's not going to leave you cold.
Hmm.
You know,
Absolutely.
I
Yeah.
mean, you know, and he always encouraged me to make this movie about the bullfighter Manolete that George Miller did, because he said, you know, it's woman, blood, sand, you know, it's again, it's drama for nothing. And sometimes I mean, a lot of times I look at movies and I just go, yeah, they're trying to make drama, but there's nothing inherently dramatic about the situation.
Hmm.
Not everything has to be a dramatic situation, but you know, you do have to, you know, some things are more dramatic than others.
Hmm.
That's why people are always making gangster movies, because it's, you know, it's always an inherently dramatic situation.
Hmm. Yeah. Yeah, I find with many of your characters that they are often loner figures, that there are or damaged characters in a way, eccentric characters, and that the stories often revolve a little bit around their identity. As in Max, I mean, this isn't the Adolf Hitler that we know. It's sort of, is he an artist or is he the person who becomes the Adolf Hitler we know? Sort of caught in between.
Yes, well, that was what that movie was entirely about.
Mm.
You know, I mean, that movie I researched the shit out of. You know, I read everything I could, you know, about Weimar, about, you know, about modernism, which, you know, I have a feeling for anyway. You know, I mean, I'm always been very interested in modern art, especially when it was political. You know, I think now modern art has lost its power, of course, because, you know, it didn't start really as an art movement. It started as a political movement.
Mm.
You know, I would think the Kaiser kind of thought of World War One like on like a overstuffed, very rococo couch, which then, you know, places the kind of Neue Sachlichkeit in a moral context.
Mm.
So yeah, something like that. You know, there. I mean, and no one knows where Herr Hitler was during those days between 1918, between the sort of fall of 1918 and the spring of 1990, when he suddenly reemerges. You know, there are people who say that he, you know, I've seen photographs that he was involved in the Munich Revolution. He
Mm.
was very much on the left or anything. But I always thought, you know, he was so identified with being an artist, and you know, he was known as the artist in his regiment, and that was his whole identity. And I thought that, you know, he could either let go of it, or you know, it was a very misunderstood movie, because people always say, well, it's a what if movie, which it's not.
Mm.
It's not a what if movie. He always was a crap artist. He was a you know, he was a shitty artist in terms of, but he had, you know, he had one idea, which was to turn politics into art.
Mm. I guess the what if part of the movie is the idea that um, could there be some sort of influence that would have prevented everything that happened? You know, I mean, the John Cusack character is fictional, but um, maybe if this or that had happened, then maybe he would have gone into another path. That is the kind of what if question,
Well,
I
that's what
guess.
John Cusack tries.
Yeah.
John Cusack has this intuitive sense. I better, even though this guy's art is not, doesn't appeal to me whatsoever. I mean, doesn't represent anyone like him. So he is trying, but he has some strange intuition about this guy that he better, you know, keep this guy close in some way.
Mm.
But it was never like he was, you know, Hitler was so contrarian. You know, everybody was, I mean, people were exploring modernism in such an aggressive way, and he was so, and in such an exuberant and dynamic way, and he was pursuing this kind of very academic thing in a very aggressive way that, you know, how he obviously almost didn't want to join uh, that kind of movement.
Mm.
But I always am convinced, as was, as were some people around him, that he was very aware of the avant-garde, on the left and the right around him.
Hmm. Yeah, I think he was aware of it because he was so afraid of it. I mean, they were trying to, especially as the movement went on and on, it became more and more conservative. And sort of they tried to shut everything out that didn't adhere to these sort of very old and classic ideals of what art is supposed to be. Um, so I guess he was aware of that, as many dictators seem to be, that art can be very subversive. Art can be very influential in its ideas, especially art that is not in the mainstream.
He knew how. I mean, his street theater, his agitprop, all of that was very, very good. I mean, not a lot of people changed the iconography around of a country.
Mm.
Of course, that's what he did. Now, it was a very conservative iconography, but
Yeah, it's certainly the kind of movie where when I watch it, I'm like, oh, please, the John Cusack character, please put him on a different path. Maybe this will be some kind of alternate universe where, something good happens and then, somehow this guy can be saved or at least sort of stopped from doing everything that followed.
yeah, well, the actors are very good in that film, I thought. I thought Cusack was great. I thought Noah Taylor was great. You
Mm.
know, you understood him as a kind of ambitious artist. Of course, he was at some point.
Mm-hmm. When you write a story like Max or many of the other movies that are, they have a historical setting, they have political ideas like The Siege, for example. Many of those stories are very serious, The Color Purple. And then you have something like Indiana Jones, which is very much a comic book adventure. What's the difference in the approach of writing these stories?
It's again, it's not as it's not I mean, Stephen is very, very good at taking material and then lightening it up. So we were just trying to get where we're trying to get his interest. Because I mean, he at that moment he is beyond a doubt the hottest director in the world.
Mm.
And George wanted to get, Indiana Jones 3 made. So we were, just thinking, okay, what's the most dynamic story? But what the thing that Stephen, of course, brings to it is that then he infuses it with his own magic. So that's much more a question for Stephen than for me.
Mm. Okay.
I'm on my usual, slightly historical, political, Third Reich, occult, let's go kind of thing. And it's Stephen who then is able to turn that into pop culture.
Mm-hmm.
And so I didn't sit down and say, okay, I have to write a comedy. I don't know very much about comedy, obviously. But I think that the thing about comedy is that it's very serious business.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, even
So,
though
I mean,
there's a line in Max which was one of the biggest laughs for me in quite a while, which is where John Cusack says he's had a bad war.
yeah, yeah. Well, yes. I mean, the absurdity, of course, was everywhere in this. So
Mm,
you constantly could. You always need something. It's back to George Miller saying drama for nothing. You always need something to bounce it off. It's like as if the
mm,
story is like a ball, and or your idea is a ball, and you want a wall that you throw it against, and it comes back at you. Like he had a bad war, or let me buy you a lemonade.
mm.
Well, normally that's so what, but in this it became like almost the most famous line of the film. So it allows you to make something new again.
Hmm. So at some point during the development of The Last Crusade, apparently George Lucas and Steve Spielberg went to a different writer, Jeffrey Boehm. So was that just because they wanted to try something new? Was that because you were disagreeing on something, or did you go to other projects?
We didn't really disagree. I had other projects. I went and rewrote Empire of the Sun, and it was just like, let's go to Jeffrey Boehm. And was it like, I didn't jump in the air with joy, but it was just kind of like, okay, I never really thought I was the person par excellence to write, Indiana Jones in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, it was kind of like, okay, I'll try that kind of thing when they asked me, and I think I brought something to it. I got it started,
Mm-hmm.
but it wasn't like this is, it's not like I sit around at home now and think, about this kind of story.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, in a way, it's an anomaly in your filmography. I mean, it has certain points of reference, like the setting, the historical setting, for example. But still, compared to many of your other stories, it's an
No, you're
anomaly.
absolutely right. I mean, it's you picked up on that very well. It's got the Crusades, it's got some historical references, but yeah, I mean, it was just a kind of like, okay, let's try that, and we take it. And what's fun is that it's not always so much fun to write something that you have your heart and soul into. Not that I didn't have my heart and soul into Indiana Jones, because I tried it as hard as I do anything else. But it's it's, in a way, it's relaxing to be more technical.
Mm-hmm.
And one thing, of course, with that you have to understand about Indy, which was their first idea, which they always held on to some degree, is that, it used to be that, the serial would end with a cliffhanger.
Mm-hmm.
And they pumped the cliffhanger into, I don't know, every 7 scenes or something, there would be a cliffhanger. Everything was a cliffhanger. I remember seeing Indiana Jones, and I was just starting to work in Hollywood, because I had written the Children's Crusade, which
Mm-hmm.
was, I mean, I spent like a year writing it, and and it became quite a well-known script, and so on the back of that, I started. But I remember going to see Indiana Jones, the first one, in the cinema, and I thought to myself, oh fuck. They've reinvented this genre now. And then, I remember walking into a producer's office. I forget his name. David Wolper,
Mm-hmm.
name really from the. And he said, listen, I want you to write me. He had some crazy idea about some story in Tibet. He says, now listen, gotta have a cliffhanger every like 8 scenes. And I'm thinking, this is this fucking Indiana Jones. So,
But
anyway.
it's true, that kind of story and the structure of the story has influenced Hollywood so much, not just in terms of the adventure movies, because there actually haven't been that many stories that exactly copy the Indiana Jones formula, but just in terms of storytelling, the way an action hero has to go through um, his adventure or his mission, right? And it's just building up and building up, and every time it's an even bigger cliffhanger and an even bigger cliffhanger. Um, I think
Yeah,
that was one of the movies that changed Hollywood for years and
completely.
decades.
Completely. And Steven did a lot of movies that changed Hollywood. Jaws changed Hollywood.
Yeah.
E.T. changed Hollywood. And it's also a kind of exuberance of, technique. And that's what people always tend to, they're just not as good as he is.
Mm-hmm.
It's difficult. I mean, it's one thing to write a cliffhanger every, 8 scenes or something. It's another one to execute it.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's true. And he
You
makes
know,
it seem very effortless.
Yeah, it takes time. It's a lot of setups. You got to shoot it here. You got to shoot it there. It's expensive. You quickly, a lot of filmmakers are quickly overwhelmed by the technical demands of that. It's again, there's a very, very large chapter in life called easy to say, difficult to do.
Mm-hmm.
That's, that falls in that chapter.
Mm-hmm.
And easy to write, difficult to do. It's easy to write,
Mm-hmm.
but to actually sit there like he does and shoot it, you know.
So did you see the finished Last Crusade movie then?
Yeah, of course I saw the finished Last Crusade movie. I walked into, I think it was, I was in San Francisco. There was a theater on Van Ness Avenue. I forget what it was called. And I remember walking in. I didn't have to, I said, I'd like in the credits. And the guy goes, oh yeah, sure, go take a look. And, it was like a hot San Francisco night. And it was like probably a Saturday night or a Friday late show or something. And I thought, wow, it's just unbelievable how that audience just reacted.
Mm-hmm.
There were like events. It wasn't like people just sitting there in a movie theater quiet.
Mm-hmm.
It's like it was an event movie. And I was happy to have played some part in it. But
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I can't claim any more than that. But I do know. I mean, it's I like I said, I think I kind of lit the match.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think every story needs that sort of the incident in a way.
Yeah. Yeah.
Um, so I'm kind of curious when I look at your career. I was talking to a friend yesterday, and I told him that we were doing the interview. I told him a little bit about what you've done. And he was very surprised to hear that you started out with Steven Spielberg movies, and then after a while, you went to Europe, and now you're making films in the Netherlands. And he said, well, usually it's the other way around. I said, well, Paul Verhoeven did the same thing, but yeah, I agree. It's kind of unusual.
Yeah, it is unusual. No, you're right. It is the other way around. It's like when Adrian Brody won the Oscar and then became a Xenia model. I said normally, you become a Xenia model and then you win the Oscar.
Yeah.
At a certain point, I really, it's such a stupid cliche, but I just really, felt like I wanted to, I just figured I'd work with Steven, and that was such a great collaboration. And for a couple of years, everything seems to be so well calibrated between us. To then work with other directors in Los Angeles, and and I wanted to direct myself, but I didn't want to direct. I mean, I wouldn't know how to direct that kind of movie in a million years. I know how to direct something like Max, but that's so it's what I wanted to do. But I actually it was a kind of mysterious thing because it wasn't like my career had gone down. I just kind of walked away from it. It was a kind of a Rimbaudian moment. And I once heard Paul Verhoeven, because we were doing sound at the same. He was doing the sound for Al, and I was doing the sound for Het Diner at the same. We were in post at the same place. I was like somewhere else, and he said, "Yeah, that guy, he just walked away, from the whole thing." And I don't know. I just felt I had done it to some degree. I mean, I literally come to Los Angeles, sleeping on my then brother-in-law's floor, and 12 years later I'm nominated for an Oscar.
Mhm.
I was kind of, I suppose I should have stuck around, and but I'm still around. So
Yeah, and I mean, you're still making very interesting movies. I saw the Réunis,
oh, did you?
the reunion. Yeah.
Oh,
Unfortunately, your latest movies are very hard to find
yes, yes,
if you don't live in the Netherlands.
yeah.
But yeah, I saw that one. I also found it very, very interesting. Also, again, in terms of the relationship between these two characters, very,
I'm so glad
very
you liked the
broken.
Réunis. I shot that. That was a nightmare because I shot it I had to shoot it so quickly.
Hmm.
It was ridiculous. I mean, there comes a point where you're shooting something so quickly, you don't even have time to really sit in the video village and look at the
Hmm.
take. I mean, you kind of have to see it as you're shooting it and go, yeah, we're moving on. But I really like the Réunis. And
How
have
many?
you seen Dîner?
Not yet, unfortunately.
The producer we're about to do another film together,
Oh,
which
okay.
is actually in English, which is Macbeth in Jail.
Okay.
I think that's a very, I was very happy with that film. Very uncompromising. Uh, there's that moment where it was such a strange thing, if I may say. Did you read the book?
No, I
Okay.
just read the little synopsis of the story,
Yeah.
but
So the book is he what he does is the author very cleverly is he presents this very kind of anarchistic character and one of the most famous scenes is where he is in this restaurant, and like we've all had this problem where you have this obsequious kind of waiter who tells you about this, about the mushrooms that have come from Italy, and it's a joke, it's a cliche,
hmm.
and this somehow or other really touched a chord with people in Holland and all over the world. But then the rest of the movie is about something very, very horrible and serious,
Hmm.
which is I'm not going to spoil it for you, but and you always sat there and you got everybody laughing, and then the movie turns.
Hmm.
And this is a very, very difficult and I think maybe almost an impossible thing to do. If you're going to make it some kind of comedy, you should keep it as a comedy.
Hmm.
I never tried to make it as, but for to sort of have a movie that is funny and then turn is a difficult thing. And I would always
Hmm.
feel the audience go, "Oh fuck."
Hmm.
And then I think to myself, yeah, but you've all read the fucking book. You know what's happening here. How am I going to make that funny? It's that difficult to make that funny. The thing that happens, the horrible thing that it all turns on, very difficult to make that into a comedy. So, but I really like it. So I'll send that to you.
Hmm. That sounds interesting, and that's a very, very difficult balance between making people laugh and then making them uncomfortable or going into a darker direction, and sort of sometimes people keep laughing in a very very uptight way because they think, okay, this is still funny or supposed to be funny, I think. So it's very interesting to see people's reactions to those kinds of movies.
Yeah, and then of course I made a completely uncompromising ending, which drove everybody insane.